Hi, virtual students. We're moving into Unit 1, Topic 5, and Part 5. And here's what your notes look like. So we're going to fill out this front side today. We're talking about what are referred to as economic systems, all right? And eventually we'll get into how the United States kind of operates within the economy and some things that they've done and some ways that they've changed over the course of the last 250 years or so. So anyway, let's get started here. First thing is, I want you guys thinking about what are some rules that are fair or good for the U.S. economy. Now, keep in mind, the economy kind of encompasses a little bit of everything. So don't think that it has to do too specifically. Just come up with some good things the United States government does or the United States system does, and you may not be super sure. And then maybe some things that you don't think are fair. So anyway, hopefully you're able to come up with something with that. Um, Again, my experience is that you guys are a little bit unsure of what rules are. Well, one rule that the United States has is that students have to go to high school until they're 17 and a half years old or whatever the age is, right? And so that can be an economic rule because the state government pays for you guys to be in school, and obviously if they tell you what to do, then um, that is that is obviously a rule, right? And so whether you think that's good or bad, that is an example of something that you could say. Okay, so it doesn't have to be super specific to the economy. Other things, taxes, you have, other things the government spends money on, whether it be welfare programs, unemployment stuff, right? You have all sorts of things that you could answer in there that really do have to do with the economy. Okay, so let's get rolling here. Like I said, we're talking about economic systems. You're writing this up at the top of the paper right here. Right here, you're defining this, and then you'll see how the chart is filled in as we go. All right, so we're talking about economic systems, the fancy way of saying, how are we going to, and in this case, a nation going to decide to use its resources to satisfy people's wants and needs. Okay, and so what kind of rules is the government going to have to satisfy as many as possible? And we'll talk about some of the challenges as we get through what that the United States has faced. But in general, as they make these decisions, they've got to face three pretty basic questions. Okay, the first thing we've got to decide is what should be produced. For each of these questions, there's going to be some limitations. Okay, so based on where your country is, versus like in like a climate situation, right? Are you an island nation? Those types of things are going to definitely play a role in the stuff that you produce. Okay, so just kind of an example, the United States isn't really very limited in anything they can produce. Our climate obviously is extremely varied from different parts of, the country. We have any number of natural resources available that we can get out of the ground. So are very unlimited in what we are, able to produce. Now, a country like Japan, though, they have some disadvantages in terms of they are a very densely populated country and they don't have a lot of land. And so they probably can't focus too much on agriculture, right? So they focus on, they're kind of famous for their electronics, and they've done some of those things, automobiles that they can ship, and they don't have to take up a whole bunch of land to produce stuff. Okay, so obviously, being an island nation too, they focus on the fishing industry. So, countries are sometimes limited to what they can do. The next thing we've got to do is figure out how it should be produced. Who's going to be in charge of putting things together to finish a product? Okay, and in the United States, it's pretty easily answered. We have private citizens that decide how to put things together. And the government does a few different things, but for the most part, it's the private citizen that's going to make these decisions. And the idea is that they are going to specialize and they are going to be able to be as efficient as possible. And the last thing we got to decide is who gets what. How are we going to distribute these resources? Which it's a little bit easier answered than what you might kind of think. In the United States, it's pretty simple. Like we just say, well, you can buy that stuff if you can afford it, right? The government does very little distribution of goods in normal normal operation. Now, that hasn't been the case forever and ever and ever. During World War II, World War I, we had some rationing of goods. The government has controlled some of those aspects of the economy at times, but it hasn't been very common in you or I's lifetime. Really, it seems like what the government's uh, capabilities in terms of trying to help out people that can't afford things is to distribute income to them, right? So whether that be a welfare program, whether that be like what we mentioned already, unemployment insurance, we basically distribute income to them, and then they can buy what they need. That's usually how the United States has um, gotten some of that distribution done. So realize, okay, and you don't have to write this down. You can if you want somewhere, but you want to be able to kind of reference it. The success of an economy has to do with money flowing through it. And whether we have businesses or individuals and those people are interacting, people buying stuff, people also obviously working for these businesses, it creates a money flow throughout the economy. The more money flowing, the more jobs available, the better off more people are. Now, that's showing just the flow of money with those two individuals. The government also plays a role, okay? And the government affects how much money we have to buy stuff at businesses. They affect that by how much we pay in taxes. They also obviously affect how much money people have through those mentioned programs, welfare, unemployment, other types of programs in terms of putting money into people's pockets. Government also buys stuff from businesses. Probably the biggest example is the military, right? The military hires businesses to produce stuff for them. And the businesses also pay taxes, which is going to affect how much money they can pay their workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So the government plays a role in how much money is going to flow through the economy. It's a pretty simple dynamic. As complicated as the economy can be, it's a pretty simple situation in terms of like, hey, listen, people are going to be affected how much money they make by the job they have, and the government can also play a role in that too. And again, the government is trying to do things to satisfy as many people as possible. Okay. So, throughout history, all right, we're going to go through a few different types of economies here, but throughout history, the economies have evolved just like anything else. So, the first, let's call them the first humans, we're going to compare them to like Native Americans, is probably something that we're a little bit more familiar with. Their day to day operation was to stay alive. And so, when they were deciding to answer these three questions, what should be produced? Like, we need to produce the things that we need, right? We had to have food today. Maybe we need some shelter today, whatever that might be in that day to survive, we are going to focus on producing, right? And you talk about like the Native Americans not wasting any product of the stuff that they killed, and how efficient they were by doing that stuff, and it's extremely impressive, right? And so the advantages are like you have a pretty stable living. However, we don't live in a traditional economy today, right? We covet stuff. We want to do things. We want to be entertained. We want to go on vacations. We want to do all these things that make our life more interesting. And so, as advantageous as traditional economies were when people took care of each other, it wasn't really there wasn't really room for growth, and people didn't necessarily have the opportunity to better themselves and create this idea of a lifestyle that a lot of you have envisioned. There are still some examples today. If you go into some indigenous tribes in Africa and South America on how these things operate, but the best example is probably Native Americans. Now, as these Native Americans became extremely successful, what we saw is, again, keep in mind, a Native American tribe had like a chief, right? And he was probably in charge of, oh, I don't know how many people, a small, maybe 1,000 people. I really don't know. And then over through the course of like the mid 13, 14, 15, 1600s, we start seeing these societies become extremely efficient and extremely successful. And so the chief system, which is the way they'd always been doing things, now stayed in charge and kind of became a king, just in charge of more people. And that king's going to have a few people basically tell other people what to do. And then those people are going to, kind of own the land and make sure in the case of like medieval times in Europe, right, the feudal system where the peasants are going to work the land. Okay. And so we have this new kind of system where, like, all right, we have all these resources we've got to produce. How are we going to do it? Well, the government's going to make those decisions. All right. And most commonly, we referred to this as communism. A better word is probably socialism. But this idea that the government is going to decide everything. All right. And so we go through that not only in like medieval Europe, but we also see it in Central America with the Mayans and the Aztecs, and the Incas. And that success is, obviously growing and growing and growing population wise. Well, eventually, as populations get big enough, people start getting frustrated. If you're a peasant in medieval Europe, you're stuck being a peasant. You're not going to do anything. You're stuck there, right? And so people didn't like that lack of freedom in terms of being able to better oneself. Some modern examples of these command economies: the Soviet Union, which is no longer the Soviet Union, it's now Russia. Cuba, North Korea is probably the most famous. This is the North Korean leader. Are probably the best examples of command economies today. But anytime a government decides to, tell its people what it can and can't do, it is a command economy technique. Okay. Now, in about the year 1750 or so, right, the starting of really the American Revolution, when we start getting these ideas that the government is the bad guy, and the government has too much power, we start seeing this idea of what's referred to as capitalism, and we can also refer to it as a market economy. And the idea is that, you know what, if we let people decide what's produced, we let them chase success, we reward them for that success, then people are going to get really good at doing things. And that competition is going to create better goods and better products for consumers and all the more innovation. And so we get the government out of it. This idea that, hey, listen, the government is actually slowing things down with all these rules. And so the idea of the American Revolution was the government's going to get out of the way. You might have heard the term laissez-faire before. Get your hand, like, the hands off of the government attitude. Well, things go really good. All right. And the United States becomes super successful. But notice the example there. I have the pre 1900s. And right around the turn of the century, late 1800s, we start seeing capitalism be able to be taken advantage of by the super successful. Think about what's happening: Industrial Revolution. Um, we have obviously very easy transportation, very easy, um, you know, production of goods, communication. And so these rich people just get richer and richer and richer, and they keep buying the small people out. And we start seeing some advantages being taken of the lower income Americans. And so the government basically says, hey, listen, everything was really good. Things have evolved, right? And let's be a referee here. And let's be this person that is, let's make sure people don't get taken advantage of. Now, in certain cases, can the referee take way too advantage of the people? Absolutely. If you've ever watched a sporting event and had the referee make every single call, that's not entertaining to watch. Just like it's not entertaining to watch if the referee doesn't make any calls, because then you feel like you're disadvantageous by the ref, right? And so these mixed economies, which is basically eventually what every economy somewhat becomes, some are going to be more socialist, some are going to be more capitalist. We start trying to mix the good and from both the government being able to help people as well as leaving it up to private citizens to do some things. Okay, so it mixes those advantages. Sometimes finding a balance is extremely difficult. Again, the Republican side of things versus the Democrat side of things, they're going to differ on what they think is important. And the dialogue of those arguments doesn't seem to be as efficient as it needs to be sometimes. But anyway, it's people do try to debate to say what's better. Again, hopefully an agreement can eventually be reached as far as, coming to some type of agreement. All right. Okay, that is it for part 5. We will talk soon.